Hi, and welcome. I'm Annette Altmans, founder and CEO of the Men Project. In this workshop titled Breaking the Cycle, Understanding and Healing Intergenerational Trauma, I'm going to define what it is and how it's passed down. And we'll look at a few examples of intergenerational trauma, as well as discuss the impact it has on people's lives. I'll talk about signs and symptoms that intergenerational trauma may present. And finally, I'll close with actionable strategies for breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. So please join us in this impactful conversation. I'm confident you'll leave our time together with new insights to consider and steps you can take to propel you into your healing journey. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Breaking the cycle, understanding and healing intergenerational trauma. It's a big topic. So what is intergenerational trauma or generational trauma, and where does it come from? It's a trauma that's experienced by one generation, and then it's actually passed down to the next, which seems strange if you just think of it topically. So trauma that transmits from one generation to the next, or from one trauma survivor to their descendants, actually impacts that next generation. It can be a one-time harmful or damaging event, or a series of harmful or damaging experiences that led one generation to use certain coping mechanisms that have certain emotional responses or unprocessed emotions. So basically, it's coping styles that may not be that healthy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But these coping mechanisms and this programming that the older generation has actually can impact how we view the world and relate to it. It could be that the generation that experienced the harm or damage didn't have the tools or resources or knowledge or support to process the traumatic event and then to heal from it. So it's unprocessed, it's unhealed trauma. And that may have led to things like suppressed emotions or overreactive behaviors and unresolved grief that we then pass down. So generational trauma can directly expose children to the effects of the parents' trauma, is what we're saying. I'm sure you can look back at your parents and you've heard stories in their lives. And if you think about ways that they maybe didn't cope well with stress or with certain triggers, you can see how those two things relate to each other. But these intergenerational traumas that translate from one generation to the next actually shapes families over time and how they connect with each other and their familial dynamics. You know, the family system is impacted, often including unprocessed pain, lacking coping mechanisms, like I said, learned destructive beliefs and behaviors. It might result in a household where conflicts do not get resolved. They're either swept under the rug. You're not allowed to talk about anything uncomfortable. You're not allowed to share your emotions because your parents are emotionally unavailable. They basically don't address topics. They don't support you in your emotional concerns or worries or doubts or fears. Or it can be overreactions where conflicts are an explosion, and where you see that your parents or grandparents didn't have the coping mechanisms to remain calm and to work through conflict resolution in a way that allows all parties to speak and then move to a solution. It might look like a parent that rages when they get triggered. And sometimes this can be over the smallest things, particularly if they're stressed about something else. But understanding the origins of trauma, its effects, and how trauma is transmitted is the first step in addressing this topic. and creating healthy and lasting change and healing within families. You have to understand how it's transmitted. That's the first step. So events that happen, reactions to the events, and decisions that come in response to those events are all part of our emotional DNA. And I find this interesting that your DNA can actually be impacted by generational trauma. It almost seems unreal or hard to accept, but your programming and the neural pathways that are produced absorb those patterns and integrate them into their psyche, coping mechanisms, and lives. So when I was a little girl, I remember how my mom didn't cope well when we would have company coming over for dinner, a holiday or a dinner party. I mean, it didn't matter how much us kids would help. She would get so stressed out that we were always going to be yelled at and told that we were ungrateful and not helping. As she was so stressed, I remember seeing her grab her hair. I mean, she was a lovely woman in so many ways, but she did not cope with stress well. I could see her go from 0 to 100 and not be able to regulate her emotions. And for the longest time, I got stressed out in the same way in my early 20s. I realized this is not a good look, and I need to really practice new coping skills. I had to learn new coping skills and practice them until they became habitual. So how can trauma be passed down? It can be biological. It's believed to be passed through DNA, and that trauma can bring about epigenetic changes, meaning that trauma can be passed to children and grandchildren, making them biologically predisposed to certain stress responses because of their ancestors' trauma. When you think about a child in the developmental stages of life, the trauma that is going, or the stress that's taking place within the household, actually can have a negative impact on their brain development. And I've talked about this in other workshops where the amygdala, which is like the accelerator in the car that makes you alert, and it's where your fight, flight, freeze, and appease automatic responses come from. That amygdala gets overdeveloped when there's a lot of stress. And the hippocampus, which is like the brake in the car that helps you regulate emotions, becomes underdeveloped. So kids are having difficult time coping because their amygdala is so reactive and ready to be in that survival mode. And the hippocampus isn't helping them regulate their emotions. And this has long-term negative effects. So it's really important that if you recognize something that you're doing, that you mitigate that with some new coping skills so that you don't pass it on, because you can break the cycle. Trauma can also even happen in utero. High stress during pregnancy can lead to the child experiencing trauma in the womb and thereafter. It can be behavioral through learned behavior, coping mechanisms and patterns learned from caregivers, and it can be environmental. There may be things about one's environment that can affect how the genes are expressed, such as high conflict marriages or family dynamics where conflict is not processed in solutions-oriented ways. It can be emotional, where unresolved emotions or trauma responses transmitted through relational dynamics is unhealthy or toxic. It might present as reactive coping mechanism rather than a controlled response in healthy communication, or it might present in ways where there are no discussions take place to resolve problems. Children in these circumstances are shut down emotionally. Their parent is not emotionally available, thereby not helping the child to understand their own emotions or to trust their gut instincts, because it's not ever validated by their parent. Their emotions are almost treated as though they're bad and inappropriate, rather than the parent really connecting with them and saying, well, tell me what you're feeling right now, and then validating those feelings. Okay, I fully understand why you feel that way. Now, then the parent should help them express those feelings in a healthy way. And that takes conversation and connection. And when that doesn't happen, the child can almost feel as though their feelings are not trustworthy. They can't trust what their gut is telling them because it's never been validated by an adult. It's only been shut down. And so it creates a lot of problems, people pleasing, and just not having the emotional IQ to navigate conflicts very well and to stand up for oneself, because they don't trust their own emotions. They don't even know if they trust their perspectives. So a few examples of intergenerational trauma: families affected by war, such as the Holocaust survivors or people that are forced into displacement, natural disasters, or even pandemics, poverty or systemic oppression, which happens in so many communities, and abuse, physical, sexual, or mental. Domestic violence and substance abuse can be passed down through generations. Patterns like self-medicating, emotional unavailability, or perfectionism, or high conflict, all of these things can affect the next generation. So let's look at some signs and symptoms of intergenerational trauma. Signs can be seen in youth in several ways. So trauma during a child's brain development, like I said, can have lasting effects. But how does that actually manifest? It can manifest into disciplinary issues, low grades at school, skipping class or dropping out of school, self-harm, like cutting and so forth, substance abuse, having a hard time making and maintaining friendships or relationships. It can also profoundly it can be disrupted to physical, emotional, and mental well-being as a whole. Because when a child is stressed or is stuffing their emotions, that produces cortisol, and that it's like a constant stress hormone surging through their body, and that affects their brain development, and it affects their ability to think clearly, to have healthy cognitive thinking. They're more hypervigilant and it's like an anticipatory fear that something bad is going to happen, or how are they going to handle it when something bad happens. So they're more in a high alert. It can affect their mental and emotional health by, you'll recognize things like anxiety, depression. So many teenagers are depressed. Feelings of inadequacy or inferiority, substance abuse, like I said. They may lack self-worth. Possibly they feel emotionally numb. And a lack of self-worth is really important. We want them to learn to love themselves and to really care well for themselves, to have a voice that is firm, that sets boundaries in a calm way. They need to have a strong sense of security and self-love to be able to implement that. And that's a big aspect of what creates a healthy person, versus when you think of the anxiety and the depression and all the feelings of low self-worth that are so damaging. And those feelings of inadequacy and a low sense of self-worth actually grooms the child to choose unhealthy people in their life to fill the void. So they're very likely to choose an abusive type of person because they haven't received emotional, healthy interactions in their upbringing. It can affect them developmentally, difficulty forming relationships. They could have this strong sense that's a fear of abandonment, which makes them extra clingy or needy, or in a high state of fear. or it can lead to them actually over functioning, doing the work for two people in the relationship, whether it's friendships or family members or a love interest. They accommodate, by over functioning, they're actually accommodating the needs or wants of their peer group. Maybe it's in a group setting, and they're not able to be a person who has good boundaries. Their life skills may be impaired. For example, critical thinking, decision making. These are all parts of the cognitive executive functioning of the brain. And managing their time, all these things can be compromised. As they grow, they may become detached from themselves or their surroundings. While the brain is developing, like I said, the amygdala in the hippocampus becomes developmentally damaged, and this can last for the rest of their life if they don't really work to improve it. The impacts of generational trauma. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What does intergenerational trauma actually feel like in your body? It's a sense of inherited emotional weight or responsibility, like you need to accommodate your parents for what they've been through. I mean, it's wonderful to validate them, but you shouldn't have to carry the weight of another generation. It could be feelings of helplessness or isolation or distrust across generations. I remember seeing or hearing about a family where whether it was the waitress or a service worker that came to their home, they always thought they were being ripped off. So you're overcharging. They were antagonistic towards these service people. You're overcharging me, or viewing a tip as like a penalty instead of a way to bless somebody's service. They just always felt like people were against them. And in contrast, you can have a family where they so appreciate service workers and they thank them and they collaborate with them and they're grateful. And so these are just two examples of how mistrust can manifest in everyday life. It can result in a feeling of needing to be overprotective of children, like to the point of paranoia or difficulty understanding why certain patterns persist despite efforts to change. So there may be family dynamics that they really want to change, but they can't seem to have a breakthrough. On the flip side, when traumatic experiences happen, the same traumatic experience can create more meaningful connections to family and community when trauma is actually worked through and resolved properly. It can actually bring you closer. It can increase your emotional understanding if you work through it. And you can actually become more compassionate towards yourself and more aware of how you need to care well for yourself to help you perform better in your relationships. But this usually requires some help from a professional who were, if you think about it, in prior generations, therapeutic professionals were not really available, or it was a stigmatized topic. So people didn't want to admit that they even saw a therapist, let alone look for a therapist. Think about our grandparents' generation. I don't know if there was any therapy that was readily available in that generation, unless you were part of an academic institution. So how does intergenerational trauma shape personality and development? Learned behaviors and patterns are passed down through generations in families. We've said that a number of times. So it may lead to hypervigilance. I mentioned that. Self-doubt. I mentioned that. And a lack of boundaries. It can make it difficult to trust others or to avoid others or certain situations. It makes them not feel the confidence to say no when they should say no. There's so many girls who were raised to feel responsible for how boys behave. And so they don't feel empowered to have a strong voice when a boy is acting inappropriately. That's just one example of being shut down and oppressed and made to feel responsible for other people's behaviors. Intergenerational trauma shapes personal beliefs. Like I just mentioned, that's a belief that girls are somehow responsible, or it manifests into a behavior and attitudes regarding parenting styles, rules in the family, or family systems, the way the whole system functions. It might have someone feeling disconnected from their culture and their heritage, or they may lack the feeling of belonging. So it can impact how you view yourself to fit in to your social circles or your heritage, your traditions, and your ethnic group, and so forth. It affects coping mechanisms and emotional regulation. I mentioned that, and I think that's such a big one. They may have witnessed overt and harmful reactions by their primary caregivers, and these processes become embedded in their own ways of dealing with conflict or triggers. It's what they learned, and it's what was passed to their DNA, where neural pathways were being formed even in the womb. And this is the way they have learned to cope with stress or with triggers, and it's unhealthy. And so it's hard to recognize that it's unhealthy if you've grown up with that your whole life, let alone change those patterns and become healthy. So breaking the cycle, approach yourself with curiosity, grace, and compassion. So I want you to feel free to self-reflect, explore your childhood experiences and these inherited patterns. Practice self-compassion for what you've endured and for your caregivers too, because I'm sure they endured something when in their upbringing. I'm not saying to excuse bad behavior, but if you express compassion towards yourself, if you have a conversation with your inner child and say, it's not your fault, it wasn't your fault, and that was so hurtful, allow yourself to just really be in touch with early childhood experiences, write some of them down and really think about them and process them, and then talk like you're a third-party objective person speaking to your inner child to affirm them, to validate them, and to remove responsibility from them. A child shouldn't carry responsibility for the way that adults behave. I mean, how many children, when their parents divorce, think it's the child's fault? There's things that you can do to nurture yourself and to help you heal from those wounds and faulty beliefs about yourself. Recognize these things without blaming yourself. View it as information to grow and heal. Even if you made lots of mistakes, understand the origin of those mistakes. Take yourself off the hook and then look for new coping mechanisms or new patterns of behaviors that you can employ to make your interactions more healthy. So these are thinking about actionable strategies, recognizing patterns like behaviors that no longer serve you. You want to heal yourself. So you might want to seek therapy or connect with supportive communities like a support group to process intergenerational trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. You want to learn, if you don't already know, you want to really understand what boundary setting is. You know, a boundary without a consequence is just a complaint. But you also want to learn that sometimes boundaries need to be flexible, and it takes some education to really learn about boundary setting so that you feel confident to set the boundary, but you can do it in a kind way. You can be firm and kind at the same time, but you also allow consequences to happen when the person doesn't comply. And it's not about controlling other people. It's about protecting yourself and staying emotionally safe. You want to reframe your narrative. So you're basically going to rewrite your story of your family with you blessed with empowerment and healing at the center of your story. So you're going to rewrite it in a way that changes the narrative so you can start reprogramming your thinking. And it's not a lie. It's just saying, instead of feeling a low sense of self-worth or feeling as a child you were responsible for certain things. I mean, when my mom was really stressed out, she would lose it. Like I mentioned, she even said, if I die of a heart attack, it's going to be your fault. I mean, that was so scary to me. I did not know what to do with that information as a small child. My mom had a bad heart and it was overwhelming. So I needed to reframe the narrative. Of course, I wouldn't be responsible if she died of a heart attack. Those were empty words that she said in haste when she was highly stressed. And the burden that I was carrying with me for so many years as a youngster, I was able to release and let go of and have a whole different perspective. That's just one small example, but there's so many ways that intergenerational trauma may have programmed your thinking patterns, and you can rewrite your narrative to make a beautiful story of compassion. Commit to ongoing work. Healing intergenerational trauma is a continuous process. It requires patience, it requires grace, and each step that you take actually creates a ripple effect that benefits you in your current life, but future generations as well. My parents used to yell. They were just, I don't mean like they were yelling at us on a regular basis. They were just louder. And so I found that with my first child, I was loud too. And then I realized this is not calming. This does not improve my connection with my children. So when my second child came, I basically just sat everybody down and said, there's going to be no more loud talking or yelling. We're going to be civilized. We're going to talk things through and be as calm as possible. And if you need to go have a meltdown, you're more than welcome to go into your room, or I may take a time out. You can scream into your pillow. You can do whatever you want, but just keep it in your room. And when you're done, then come out and we'll talk about it. And it made such a difference to just give permission to be angry, but not to vomit all over everybody else in the room. And you can experience resilience as you work through your own generational trauma. You can develop a renewed sense of self and appreciation for your new beliefs in life, for the new things that you've learned, overcoming what your ancestors endured. You can create deeper emotional connections with your loved ones because it's a safer emotional relationship, and you can deeply heal spiritually. It's attainable. You can do it alone, but I think you would benefit from doing some work on your own and some work with a therapist. If it becomes appropriate, compassionately discuss traumatic events with a parent or grandparent and listen to their stories and experiences. Healing can happen in families when traumatic events are talked about, and you can actually affirm your parents and validate their experiences, telling them things like it was not your fault and how hard it must have been for them. You can actually help them have a healing moment where you show them compassion. I'm not saying to give them permission to treat you badly, but you can show them compassion and still set limits on how you interact with them if they're emotionally abusive or raging and so forth. If your family member doesn't want to talk about it, or they treat the matter as though it's a stigmatized topic, or if they're shut down, healing is going to be a lot harder for that to happen. It's a roadblock to healing. But that doesn't mean that you can't do the work to heal yourself for future generations. Talk to your inner child, write down traumatic experiences and what made you feel shame. Shame is a really big one that you want to overcome. It does not help your persona to feel shame. It's okay to feel a healthy amount of guilt for decisions that were morally compromised or where you ignored your character values. It's okay to feel a healthy amount of guilt, particularly if it negatively impacted another person. But that's saying that your behavior was bad. Shame is when you say, I'm bad. My whole persona is bad. And we don't want to think those thoughts. If you think those thoughts or think, I'm never going to find a partner in my life, or this is all I deserve is to be in an abusive relationship. Who else will ever love me? Those are feelings of shame that you need to work with somebody to overcome, to get to the core reason why it's there in the first place, usually from generational trauma and parenting styles, and then working with that inner child and correcting those things. Healing begins with awareness. Recognizing patterns allows you to change. Educate yourself by learning more about the type of trauma you experienced. Education is key. Be curious. Read about intergenerational trauma, or read about the type. If you're able to identify the trauma and the pattern intergenerationally, work on that. Read about those things and what you can do. Educate yourself. You're certainly not the only person who experienced this trauma. So there's a lot of materials out there. If it was childhood abuse or molestation, sexual assault, in so many things, domestic violence, you can learn a lot about that and really remove a lot of the shame from your experience and the tendency to repeat that cycle and change it for future generations. Each day, begin with your story again, your new narrative. Tell yourself your new narrative and really work at reprogramming the way you view yourself. I want to encourage you to stay on a journey of healing and learning. I want you to love yourself and to show yourself grace and compassion. This is a process that's going to be uncomfortable at times. You might have some difficult conversations with your parents if you feel safe enough to do that, or difficult conversations with a therapist. It's not always easy to work through trauma, but it's so worth it in the end if you do. So next month's workshop is going to be trauma-informed parenting for survivors. Recognizing and beginning to heal from your own generational trauma also impacts how you're going to parent your children. And we're going to talk about trauma-informed ways that you can do that really well. You want your children to be resilient and to have a strong self-identity. You want them to feel empowered and to really love themselves, so that then other people know how to love them and that they won't accept less than being treated properly. There's a science to it, and hope for transformation and healthier, brighter, stronger futures for generations to come after you. So we'll dive into that in our next workshop. You're not alone in this journey. We are here for you at the Men Project. And by addressing intergenerational trauma, you're breaking cycles and creating a legacy of healing and resilience for you and for the future. And I hope that you'll embrace that. Take really good care of yourselves. That's the number one thing, is take care of yourself, whether you're helping another person or you're going to be reflecting on your own intergenerational trauma, or whether you're walking alongside someone who's being abused. Take really good care of yourself. Okay, till next time. Bye.